We've spent $20 billion to house a bunch of people in old hotels and motels in California over the last 5 years and told them that they can shoot dope inside the hotels. We said it's okay because that's harm reduction. It's okay. And not spending any money on building drug treatment beds or mental health beds for people that actually need it.
We need more mental health workers. And I'm like, yes, we do. Who wants to do it and how much are you going to pay them?
If you're a case manager and you get hired to work on the street crisis response team, you're making $25 an hour. So you're being asked to do everything that you just said for $25 an hour. You're right. Why would you want to do it? And for someone struggling with addiction, even though they'll tell you that they want to get off drugs, that usually doesn't mean today.
This is going to be an interesting episode. Normally when I speak to guests, we're talking about fitness, finance, and overall mental health. But sometimes in order to do that, we need to talk about some of the real life issues that are going on in the world, specifically in this case, homelessness, drug addiction, and really where the country is going. So I really believe that this is information that a lot of you would like to know, but aren't really sure where to find the correct information from. And I'm lucky to have on a former guest who has a tremendous amount of experience in this field. He is currently the director of West Coast Initiatives for the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions, and he's a recovery advocate. And I'd like to welcome back Tom Wolf to the show. Thank you, Tom, for coming on.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be back.
And for those of you that don't know, Tom was a guest on this show about 1.5 years ago, and he was featured in the book San Francisco by Michael Schellenberger, where he goes over his entire story and really opens up a lot of people's eyes about some of the things that are really going on the streets. So I'm excited to get into it, Tom. But first of all, how's everything been since the last time that we talked?
Oh, man, things have been going unbelievably well. So my advocacy has grown bigger than ever. And, you know, for the listeners out there that don't know, I'm formerly homeless and I'm in recovery from addiction. In 2018, I spent 6 months on the streets of the Tenderloin in San Francisco. So I lived through this experience that we're all kind of witnessing, kind of unfolding and continuing to unfold in San Francisco and beyond. And now I've become kind of this advocate that's really focusing on the West Coast and Western United States. So San Francisco, LA, Portland, Seattle, Denver, and then moving east to kind of spread the word and to tell the truth about what's really happening out here on the streets, and to talk about recovery as being a solution, recovery from addiction as being a solution to much of the crisis we're seeing out there.
That makes so much sense. And for the listeners who maybe just know that there's a homelessness issue, they know that there's a drug addiction issue, but aren't really sure what that really means, kind of give us today in the year 2023, last quarter of 2023, what is the state of specifically San Francisco? Since everybody around the country assumes this is ground zero for drug addiction, homelessness, and whatnot, it's only natural to say if things are starting here, what are they doing to the rest of the country? So what is the state of the city today for all this?
Well, San Francisco is in a state of flux right now in the way it addresses its homeless and drug crisis. So we are the epicenter of the opioid and overdose crisis in the Western United States, and maybe second only to Philadelphia in all of the United States. Per capita, we have one of the highest rates of drug overdose per capita in all the United States. And this year through September, we've had 620 overdose deaths in San Francisco alone. So the problem is still huge. It's out of control. But what I mean by a state of flux is that there's been a seismic shift in our approach to addressing the overall street conditions out there, and in our approach to the organized drug dealing that's happening on the streets of San Francisco. And it's all in response to, you know, the work of a lot of different people that have been advocating for change. That includes people that, you know, helped with the recall of the previous district attorney, all the way to recovery advocates like me that just post stuff on Twitter all the time to try to change the narrative and to kind of raise an alternative perspective to what's actually happening out there. So right now, what you have out here is you have still about 800 to 1,000 organized drug dealers working in various shifts in San Francisco. That was the same as last year. You still have about 80 kilos of fentanyl that have been seized this year by SFPD just in the Tenderloin, but that's probably 10% of what's actually out there.
Jeez.
You still have somewhere between 4 and 20,000 homeless people. We don't actually know. We know there's about 4,500 sleeping rough that are actually in tents and sleeping in doorways on the street. But there's also 20,000 people that have accessed homeless services this year in San Francisco alone. And when you think about all those RVs that are parked out by Lake Merced and Stonestown Galleria and out by Candlestick, where Candlestick used to be, the problem is huge. It's humongous. And drugs are playing a major part in keeping people out there on the street. And so the state of flux has been, well, the city has decided that they're going to crack down, right? They've brought in Operation Overdrive from the Department of Justice. Actually, Speaker Emerita Pelosi requested that to happen, which basically gives more power to the DOJ and the DEA to come in here and do more federal work to bust organized drug dealing. The police have been supplemented by the California Highway Patrol in the Tenderloin, and the San Francisco Sheriff's Department have reallocated deputies to help with the street response. You have the U.S. Marshals, you have the DEA. I've seen them all out there on the street. And their focus isn't the drug user, their focus is the drug dealer, right? Because the drug dealer is who's bringing the drugs to those users. And yes, some of the users get caught up too, because most of the time they're bipping or they're boosting, they're breaking the law. So now guess what? All of a sudden we're trying to bring accountability back, which is something that we systematically removed over the last 5 years. And so that's that flux that you're seeing right now on the street.
Gotcha. And so for people who don't understand this whole drug addiction thing that we have going on, in your experience, at least specifically here, is this, are these people who just felt, they got addicted maybe through prescription drugs and then the cycle just started from there? Do they not have a direction? And so the only thing they have going for them in their life is to sit on the street and the only thing I can do is drugs? Or is this much more of a bigger problem? Because people kind of want to understand, how does somebody even get into this whole mess that some people are in on the streets?
Well, the answer is yes, they're all of the above to the things that you were saying. You have some people that got addicted to drugs at an early age, maybe because of an injury. There are people like me that got addicted later in life because of an injury. There are people that grew up in a household with generational addiction, whose parents were struggling or are struggling with addiction. You have people that are victims of domestic violence and family violence, sexual violence, that are out on the street. You have people that are from the LGBTQ plus community that are out there struggling because of the identity issues and their family not accepting them. And there's a lot of different reasons. And then, there's shreds of truth and the other things that you hear so much about all the time. Well, it's just a housing issue, or it's a wage inequality issue, or it's a systemic racism issue. There are shreds of truth in all of those things too. So there's no one answer. And this is what's so frustrating about homelessness, is that homelessness and the causes of homelessness are not monolithic, but our response to homelessness is monolithic. It's a one-size-fits-all solution where we just have decided that we're going to pour $20 billion over 5 years in California to just focus on housing. And, I put out a poll on Twitter yesterday about that. I'm like, well, we spent $20 billion in the last 5 years. Has the problem gotten worse or better? Or where's the money was the third option. And 2% of the respondents, it was about 600 respondents, said the problem was better. So the question is that why are we answering this problem with one solution while there are 20 or 30 different causes of the actual problem itself? So I think we need a multitude of different solutions, from housing to treatment to law enforcement, et cetera, to actually address this crisis on a broader scale.
Man. So what, in your opinion, has been working? If there's anything, because this has been going on for such a long time, at some point we'd like to say this solution or this tactic here is working better than most. Is there anything there that people can point to and say, well, at least that's in our favor?
Well, in San Francisco specifically, there's been a lot more talk about funding and expanding residential treatment, which is actually where someone goes into a treatment facility and stays there for 90 days or maybe 6 months or maybe even longer, right? And then there's been a lot of talk of funding what they call transitional housing or step-down housing, which is sober housing, where people can go live after they've completed treatment, so they don't have to either go back to the street or go live in an SRO in the Tenderloin, which is riddled with drug use, right? So that's one of the real positives, right? We've also put a new district attorney in San Francisco. She's not new anymore, but Brooke Jenkins is the DA now, and she believes that fentanyl is one of the crises of our generation, and she's right, it is. And so she's doing what she can as the city's top cop to really bring accountability back into the picture, especially for those that are selling the drugs out there. And so those are some positive signs that we're moving in the right direction. But other than that, no, there hasn't been a ton of success despite all the money that the city's been spending. They're trying to build housing, but you see, like, we're not going to meet the state mandate for us to build however many thousands of units of housing we have to build. I think it's 80,000 units by 2028. There's no way in hell that San Francisco is going to be able to meet that demand. And so the state is going to take over,
Yeah.
deciding what gets built in San Francisco and how fast and all of that, because the city just can't get out of its own way because of politics mainly
Yeah.
to build that housing and do what they've all virtue signaled that they need to do to solve homelessness, which is housing. So it's kind of hypocritical, really, when you think about it. But I've also been traveling around the country a lot, and I've been going to other cities and finding out the different models that they're doing. And, not a ton of success, especially on the West Coast. Denver is kind of at a crossroads. They have about 6,000 homeless people in their city, but they're kind of tipping towards the California model of what we're doing out here, tiny homes, or RV parks, things like that, despite them having 5,000 shelter beds that go, many of them which go unused every night. But there are a couple of cities, Houston, because they have relaxed zoning laws, they can build housing very, very quickly. And that's helped mitigate some of their homeless issue. It doesn't solve the drug issue necessarily because people are using inside, but it does take away the visible homeless to an extent from where that you see here that they've done in Houston because they built housing so quickly. So that's one way that it can help. But really, I want to bring it back to the fact that in a city like San Francisco that's really compact and it's really impacted in that there's not a lot of space to build any longer, we really need to put our onus and our focus on treatment to get people off of drugs so that they can reintegrate themselves back into society.
Well, that's been one of the big challenges here. And to people who don't live in San Francisco or don't know anything about the city other than what they see on the news, it's easy to say it's all San Francisco politics. It's all the progressives. It's all whatever. But there's always more of a bigger story to that. So in regards to specifically San Francisco, is all of this just San Francisco's fault, or is there other things at play, such as the state legislation, such as the judiciary, laws that are passed federally? Are there other factors that are causing San Francisco to suffer with this more than if it was just all the city politicians?
Okay, so there's like 3 different ways I'm going to answer this question. So
Go with it.
So first of all, yes, a lot of it is San Francisco's fault because it's like the politics in San Francisco are like a knife fight in a phone booth between the extreme far left Democratic Socialists, the progressives, the progressive Democrats, and the moderate Democrats. There's no Republicans here. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like light blue versus dark blue versus deep blue, and they're all duking it out with each other, which is ridiculous, instead of them actually stopping and putting down their ideology for a minute and trying to find solutions. But yes, the problem goes way deeper, obviously. So San Francisco is a regional magnet. One of the reasons they're a regional magnet is that counties in Northern California, more rural counties throughout Central California, for example, have no services for the homeless or very little services for the homeless. There are entire counties throughout the state of California that have no treatment beds. They don't even have one drug treatment bed at all. So that combined with changes to state law around funding streams and how they're directed in regards to housing, and how they're directed away from treatment, and how funding streams for housing and treatment are 2 completely separate things and you can't combine them together. Also changes to the, in criminal justice reform, for better or for worse, there's been a ton of unintended consequences around reduction in penalties for quality of life crimes. You put all that together and it's like, yeah, you have like a 3-layered problem. You have a problem at the state level with state law. You have a problem with surrounding counties not having parity with San Francisco in regards to the homeless services that they're being offered. And that really goes for a lot of California. And because LA is also a magnet too, for the nation, not just for California. And San Francisco is too for the nation, but more so regionally. And then you have a problem with this political discourse being so toxic in San Francisco.
Man, that's incredible. So one thing that I heard you say there is that people who come to San Francisco from other parts of the state where there are no beds, there are no resources, might be coming here partially because, well, if I'm going to sleep on the street and use drugs, at least I can go somewhere where there's other things around me.
That's right.
So does that problem also shift to other cities in the nation, maybe even in red states? We know it's in LA, but think of Dallas, Austin, what else would be, we talked about Denver, Miami. Are these states also seeing a similar flux of the people within the state that can't get resources out in the rural counties coming to the big cities?
So yes, that's been, and it's been that case for a long time. You know, Chicago has a huge homeless problem, not actually as visible as it is in San Francisco, but that's because Chicago is really big and it's the kind of way they have it all set up. It's separate. It's like their homeless problems on the south side.
Yeah.
But you go to northern Chicago and you don't really see it as much.
Well, really fast, I think people forget that about San Francisco is that the Tenderloin, which is ground zero for all this, is also right next to the tourist capital, Union Square, downtown. So when all the tourists go there, they see the Tenderloin right there and think this is all San Francisco.
That's right.
But if the Tenderloin was out, for example, out in the Bayview district and it wasn't in downtown, tourists wouldn't have the same opinion of it because they just wouldn't see it as much.
That's right. And what's happened is that, you know, Tenderloin has always been considered a containment zone for drugs and poverty and all the stuff here, right? But the problem's gotten so big is that it's spilled over. It's spilled over into Soma. It's spilled over into Hayes Valley, Haight-Ashbury, and now it's really spilled over into the Mission. The Mission is just like, damn.
Mm-hmm.
It's just damn. I don't know how else to say it. It's struggling. Tents everywhere, illegal street vendors everywhere. The drug dealers have moved out by 16th and Mission now, where they just used to be, you know, they used to be some out there, but now it's like, bro, it's the same guys you see out in the L's are now down in the Mission slinging fent. And it's really a huge, huge problem. And it's sad because it's really affecting that neighborhood. And that district, District 9 in San Francisco, is, you know, one of the more progressive districts in San Francisco. And, you know, their very, very, very progressive supervisor, Hillary Ronan, just announced that they're going to make street vending illegal in the Mission because the problem is so far out of control. So it's you know, life comes at you fast.
Yeah.
It does. And I keep saying this over and over. It's almost a cliche now that, you know, you want to be progressive. I'm cool with that. I'm a Democrat. But progressive policy doesn't work without public safety. And that's the big thing that they screwed up on, is that they thought that criminal justice reform and taking the police out of the equation, that everyone was just going to behave in this utopian society, right? Which is absolutely insane that they even thought that, and that was entertained with the whole defund the police aspect and abolish prisons and all that stuff that you hear all the time. Mm-hmm. It's literally like Marxist thinking. It doesn't work in the society in which we live, right? So you want to be progressive and altruistic, cool. You know, you want to drive an electric car, cool. I drive one. I'm down, reducing my carbon footprint, right? But when I call 911 because someone's breaking into my house doing a home invasion, yeah, I damn well want the cops to show up and stop that guy. And I don't want to see him again either. And that's the problem, right? So that's really the problem. And I kind of lost the rest of your question there. Sorry.
It was talking about how the transition from rural areas to the bigger cities. And we talked about how in San Francisco, it's the regional magnet for all Northern California. And it gets put on the radar because of its history here. But then we're seeing it in Los Angeles. So people automatically think, well, it's all California. It's got to be all the blue politics, which definitely has a part to play. But then when we were talking earlier, when you go to other states like Texas or Florida, and like I see the same problems there, it's put in a different way, but they're dealing with the same things over there. And these are red states that are supposed to be more pro-law enforcement.
Look, we could go back and forth all day about policy being one of the problems, because it is. Because I've been to Austin, Texas. They have a huge homeless problem in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas is a blue city in a red state, right? The governor of Texas, who's extremely conservative, is in Austin, Texas. But Austin, Texas itself has a couple of members of their city council that are Democratic Socialists. They're super progressive, blue state, and they have a tremendous problem with homelessness. That's not to say that there aren't other cities that don't, because there's a natural attraction for urban centers for people that are struggling with homelessness because there are just more services there. So which really speaks to the larger issue aside from policy. So it's like problem one, policy. Problem 1A is that we need regional parity, or that we need more resources in rural communities for people that are struggling with homelessness to help them reestablish themselves within their own community so that they don't have to become migratory and move to large cities and put an unfair burden on large cities like San Francisco and LA.
Now, I definitely want to get into that. But before I do, I want to mention Dallas, because we were talking about how they've been able to handle the problem in a way that seems to work for that city. What have you seen there that's worked? And is it anything that can be moved to other cities like San Francisco?
Well, it's interesting. Somebody asked me the other day, what cities are actually doing a pretty good job around homelessness? And there are always three cities that come to mind for me. It's Houston, Texas, Miami, Florida, and New York City to an extent until
New York, huh?
Yeah, until they ran into this issue with all the illegal immigration issue recently, right? And that's because New York City has what they call a right to shelter ordinance that's been in place for about 3 decades, going on 4 decades now, where basically what they're saying that from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., if you're homeless, you have to be inside. And they built enough shelters to actually shelter everybody for the night. And that's kept their homeless problem somewhat under control, in that it's not as visible as you see in West Coast cities, right? So they have 90,000 homeless people in New York City, believe it or not. But they have about 86,000 shelter beds in New York City too. Do the shelters suck most of the time? Yeah. But look, I've stayed in a shelter. I've also slept on the street, and I slept in a jail cell. And a shelter is the best one of those three options. So it's not great, but it seems to have kind of worked. Miami has taken a different approach. They're definitely more law and order focused about banning street camping. They just don't allow it to happen. And so there's not a lot of tolerance for it. So as a result, people disperse from Miami because it's not a welcoming place for people to be unhoused. So they don't have a huge homeless problem. Houston, again, they have the zoning. They don't have the zoning problems. They put up a bunch of cheap housing really, really fast, which, that's Texas for you. It's flat. There's lots of land. So it's easy to build. And they've taken a lot of the problem and moved it out of sight, right? And housed people and are trying to provide them services. Is the drug problem and overdose problem still a problem there? Of course it is, just like it is here. Most people that are dying in San Francisco right now of overdose are dying behind closed doors at a fixed address and permanent supportive housing, not as much on the street as you would think. So that's another issue. Dallas is kind of just, it's a combination of both things. They have more housing, they have some shelter, and they have a strong law enforcement aspect. In fact, I think the chief of police in Dallas used to be the chief in San Jose.
That's right.
So he knows acutely what the deal is, because guess what? San Jose has a huge homeless problem, right? So he came in there understanding the way we conduct policy in California around homelessness, and maybe understood that we need to pivot a little bit to the center on this approach. And he seems to be pretty effective.
Man, I see why a lot of people in my network moved to Florida, moved to Miami. I love Miami. And then, when you have the support of the public saying, yeah, we want these laws into place. We were talking about, if you build housing, like let's say Houston, we say, let's put everybody in a house. Okay, they're off the streets. They're sort of out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't solve the whole drug issue. It just, your average Joe walking down the street doesn't see him. So we don't know the problem still exists. So getting back into the recovery part here, you had mentioned these treatment programs. Have you seen any of those treatment programs that work? And really, is it something that people are willing to spend money on to make it happen?
Well, I think people are waking up to the realization that, oh crap, we have this unbelievably huge drug and addiction crisis on our hands. I think the fact that 110,000 people died of a drug overdose in the United States last year was a big wake-up call for people, whereas in 2010, 17,000 people died of a drug overdose in the United States. So the number of OD deaths have grown by almost a factor of 10 in a 13-year period. That's super concerning. You hear a lot about fentanyl and how it's kind of changed the game. You hear a lot about unsuspecting kids purchasing what they thought was some maybe Xanax off of Snapchat as an example, but it was actually a fentanyl-laced pill, and they took it and they overdosed and died. High school kids. I know parents who lost kids as young as 14 to this, right? And my son's 14. So it's very aware in my mind. And if you have kids out there, it should be very aware to you. And if you're a young person, you should be very aware of that too, that if you're buying dope from a friend or off of social media and whatnot, if you can't test your drugs, it's better off just not to do it right now, because right now 8 out of 10 illicit drugs that are seized by the police right now, in general, across the board, across the country, are laced with fentanyl. So when you're at a party and someone is chopping up some cocaine and you're about to do a line, just understand that there's an 80% chance that there's fentanyl in that. So that's something that should give you pause, right? About the drug issue. And that's like one of the biggest things for me, that it's still like we're still grappling, we're struggling to get our hands around it. And the thing is that if you've fallen into addiction, right, where you're now dependent upon those drugs, you're not just a recreational user anymore. You actually have to use your fentanyl every 2 hours in order to just function. Otherwise, you get dope sick. The only way out of that for you is treatment. The only way out of it for you is to stop. There's no, you can't manage your fentanyl addiction. There's harm reductionists that will say that you can, but they're lying to you. You cannot. Okay. The fentanyl is all or nothing. You can't, it's not like heroin where you could live for 30 years on heroin and be an intravenous drug user and actually do it for 30 years and you'd still live.
That's
right?
crazy. Wow.
But fentanyl, it's like 2-3 years tops. And you're going to overdose and you're going to die eventually because it's so much stronger, and it absorbs into your body so much faster and it metabolizes in your bloodstream so much faster than heroin ever did. Whether you smoke it or inject it or snort it, that it just wipes you out and it shuts your heart down, and that's it. And you're dead. And, if someone's there to revive you, good. But, like right now in San Francisco, 70% of all the overdose deaths that are happening every month are happening inside alone, where people are using alone. And so really the way out of that is to get people off the drugs and also to make the drugs harder to get. Because right now in the city, you can go buy a point of fentanyl, which is 1/10 of a gram, $5-10 right now. When I was out on the street in 2018, it was $20-30 for a point. So the price has dropped 50, 60, 70% from what it was.
Wow, everything else goes up, like it costs the eggs and milk, but for some reason the drugs go down. That's crazy.
That's right.
This gets back to the whole supply and demand argument. And we've been dealing with this in this country for 40, 50 years, ever since Nixon started that whole war on drugs thing. Is you try to stop the supply, but if there's still demand there, these smugglers, they're going to find ways to get it in here. We don't have the means or the willingness to spend that much money to safeguard the entire border of this country. There's just no way that we can actually do it. So the more that we put out there, the more these people say, well, I'm ingenious, I can find a way to get around it. And they come up with some creative ways, these smugglers, to get things into the country. Mm-hmm. So then we shift over to the demand side, or that's the whole supply side. We shift over to the whole demand. How do we get people to not even want to do this in the first place? And this has been the big struggle, is at some point you could have all the resources in the world, but somebody's got to take that first step and say, I need help. I'm ready to get into the program. I'm willing to commit. They already know in advance that it's going to be hard for them, especially if they've been addicted for years, to get off of it. And that's the most critical time, because you start getting into the withdrawal stage, you tend to go back into what makes you feel good. So how do we answer that age-old question of getting people to want to get the help that they need? And if they don't want to do it, is that where we can bring back the law enforcement type to say, well, we've given you opportunities, but if you're not going to do it, you can't sleep here anymore. You can't be on the street. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the reducing the demand is really the big question. And we kind of touched on it a little bit before we started talking on this podcast. Look, there's something going on in this country where you have a lot of young people that, for whatever reason, and there's a variety of different reasons, are feeling like maybe they can't succeed. Because if you look at the demographics of people that are entering into homelessness and the demographics of people that are using drugs right now, there's a growing proportionality of people that are young, like 0 to 18, like that age group. So like when they're 12, 13, 14, 15, they're starting to use, and then 18 to 45. There's a really large proportion of people that are addicted to drugs in that age group. And so you have to start asking, what are the circumstances that led up to that? And what can we do to mitigate those circumstances? Well, for the folks that are thinking about falling into that, right, we really need to focus on awareness, first of all. Raising awareness of how dangerous this new drug, fentanyl, and all of its derivatives, tranq, iso, all these different versions of fentanyl that are out there right now, how dangerous they are, how it's contaminated the drug supply. So unless you're getting your drugs from a doctor or pharmacist or you're drinking alcohol out of a bottle, or you're eating like an edible from a marijuana from a dispensary, there's like I said, there's an 80% chance that there's going to be fentanyl in that drug. So it's really about awareness, and then drug education. If you have kids, if you're a young person yourself, find out like what this drug can do to you. Find out, look at the overdose death rates, how many people are dying. Look at the demographic of the age range of the people that are dying. Look at their socioeconomic status. It's not just poor people that are dying. You've got people now dying in middle-class white neighborhoods of drug overdose all the time. And that's because fentanyl has permeated into those communities, being mixed in with crystal methamphetamine, crystal meth. It's being mixed in with all kinds of cocaine, and it's just killing all kinds of people. And so there's that. And then there's about, what do we do once that person is addicted and they need treatment? Well, we have to start thinking about trade-offs. This whole crisis, the drug crisis, homeless crisis, is really about trade-offs in the end. If someone has fallen so far down into their addiction that they're now on the street, they've been maybe kicked out of their house or lost their housing, and I want to make that clear that homelessness doesn't just mean that you had an apartment and you lost your job and you couldn't pay your rent and you got evicted and now you're on the street. Homeless also means that you were a married father of 2 and you were terrorizing your wife and kids because of your addiction. So your wife kicked you out of the house and slapped a restraining order on you and you had nowhere to go. That's also homelessness. Or you're somebody's son and you were stealing money from your parents to support your drug addiction and they had enough and they booted you out of the house. That's homelessness. We have to understand that, because now you hear more and more people saying, well, you're only homeless if you actually had a house and now you don't. That's bullshit. Right? We have to be honest, right? There's all these people that are out there for all those different reasons. And when you get to that point where you're living in a tent and you're smoking fentanyl every 2 hours and you're going into Target and you're boosting and then selling your stuff down on Market Street to get enough money to buy your dope, and you refuse to go to treatment, even though you've been talked to how many times by the homeless outreach, by HSOC, or the homeless, or the SCIRT team, the street crisis response team, and et cetera, you turn them down. At a certain point, we have to draw the line and make a trade-off and be like, bro, you're out here, you're struggling with addiction, you've got open abscesses all over your body from missing when you shoot intravenously, you have body lice, you're clearly near death, right? You're sick. We're going to take you out of this situation and, hospitalize you. Sometimes maybe it has to be jail too, get you cleaned up, get you on some medically assisted treatment, some Suboxone or methadone, and we're going to put you into treatment. And if you look at studies, this is what kills me, is that you hear all these advocates say, well, forced treatment doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Bullshit. There are studies out there that show that actual mandated treatment from drug court versus voluntary treatment have the same outcomes. That means the same percentage of people complete treatment from either one of those stages. So again, when you get all the way down to the point where you're out here on Van Ness shooting dope every day, stealing to support your addiction, we as a community have to decide that when are we going to draw the line? Is it going to be here so we can try to save that man's life or a woman's life, or is the line going to be death? Because that's kind of where we're at right now.
Well, you pretty much said it all in one sentence right there. And that's the thing that we're struggling with, is that I would like to think that the people who are struggling on the streets know that, hey, I'm doing something that's hurting my body. It's reducing my life expectancy. This is not what I want to do. I would think that they would know that already. And they're still saying, yeah, I know it, but what else is going on in my life? How much of well, let's just get this part out here first. I would say 85, 90% of the people on the streets are going to be male, correct?
Yeah, I think it's about 85% right now.
And how many of these people, in your experience, do you think just never had what I call a purpose? They never had a job, a trade that they can feel proud of. They never had the family support or upbringing. So in their mind, it's like, well, I have nothing going for me. There's nothing I'm good at. So what else am I going to do? What do you think about that?
40 to 50%.
Really?
Yeah, half, close to half. So look, you have to look at demographics. If you go around San Francisco and kind of assess the homeless population, and you go to different neighborhoods, you'll find very different demographics and very different reasons for homelessness. So if you go to Bayview Hunters Point, the demographic is largely African American. And many of those people that are struggling with homelessness are from here. They're from San Francisco, and they just grew up in poverty, and addiction, drugs was part of that cycle, right? And then they ended up homeless. And also law enforcement, maybe getting felony convictions, et cetera, at a younger age, doing time in jail, prison, those kinds of things have all factored into the circumstances for many of them to be on the street right now. And then you come down to the Tenderloin, and you'll see the demographic of, there's a lot of elderly people that are housed in SROs in the Tenderloin that were chronically homeless. And then you have a bunch of young folks on the street, young white men and women on the street that are not from San Francisco. I want to just stress that again. They are not from here. They are from Northern California and the Central Valley, and maybe some from Oregon too. And you go up and you ask them, where are you from? Well, I'm from Fresno. Where are you from? From Yuba City. Where are you from Redding, right? And why are they here? Well, because up there, when I think there's lots of reasons. There's generational trauma in their family, abuse, generational addiction, right? Lack of job opportunities, the deindustrialization of America. There's no blue collar jobs anymore. Everything's a service job now, or you have to be highly skilled in tech or have a niche like being medicine or law or something like that. So that's a challenge for some folks. Many of them started using drugs at a young age for various reasons, including, to escape the trauma of maybe an abusive household or something like that. So there's lots of different reasons why. And I'm not discounting any of those reasons as being completely valid and deserves our compassion, as they should. I went through a significant emotional event in my life too that led to my addiction, right? So I get it. But that's not an excuse for you to just give up and live on the street and shoot dope all day and steal all day to support your addiction. At a certain point, you have to be held accountable. And accountability is a cornerstone of recovery. Ask anybody in recovery from addiction and alcoholism. They'll tell you that, at some point in my recovery, I had to own the things that I did in my addiction. I had to make amends to my family. I had to make amends to my community. That's accountability. And when are we going to draw the line and say, you know what? Some of these folks out here, a subset of these people on the street, require intervention and some accountability. Until we make that conscious decision, and we're starting to, and that's what I mean about San Francisco being in flux right now. We're starting to make that decision, which is great. And I take some measure of credit for that through my advocacy work of raising awareness. It's like, hey, I used to shoot dope. I used to be on the street. I'm here today because I was held accountable. I'm not saying that works for everybody, but there is a subset of people on the street that it will work for, and we need to start thinking in those terms for that group of street. And that subset of people are the ones that are the most visible, that always make it onto social media in some video, end up in the news, that the news wants to talk the sensational stuff about crazy guy naked in the street walking around. There was a guy this morning that was yelling at the cops. He'd been on a binge for like the last 5 days because of meth. And he was just naked in the street, like doing push-ups, going crazy, blocking traffic, right? Things like that. Like those folks needed intervention, right?
Yeah.
And when we intervene on that population while we're doing the law enforcement part to actually try to mitigate, manage the organized drug dealing and the drugs, because you were right what you said earlier, we're never going to stop all the drugs coming into this country. But it doesn't have to be 10 metric tons of fentanyl like it was last year. It could be 4 or 2. Why does it have to be 10 or more, right? That's killing so many people, right? Interdiction is part of the solution. Does interdiction mean that we're going to be able to stop all the drugs? No, and nobody's saying that, right? Anybody saying that, that's a pipe dream. You're right. It's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Being that most of the drugs are coming in through legal ports of entry in the United States anyway, being smuggled in. The people that are crossing the border illegally that the Republicans make all this noise about and everything, I get it. But that's a separate issue because those folks aren't carrying dope. People that are carrying dope are like they're coming in on vegetable trucks and onion trucks, people's cars. They're smuggling them across the border in Tijuana or in Arizona, and they're bringing them into the United States for distribution. That's what's happening. So we need to figure out how we can better, squeeze that off as best we can to make it harder for people to get high. And then we need to do our part locally to make it easier for people to access drug treatment.
Yeah, and that accountability is key. And your whole story about what you went through and getting addicted to the opiates, getting on the street, and then having to be taken to jail several times before someone said you're not leaving until you take this, and getting into treatment, and that's what it took for you to get there. That is a big thing that I try to push on the show. Is we all have things that happen in our life. We all make mistakes. I've made my fair share of mistakes throughout my life, and I've held myself accountable to them. I'm not proud of some of the things I've done in my past, but it's helped me learn. It's helped me become a better person. And this is what is one of the missing links I see on people on the street is at some point, if you do not want to make yourself better and you're becoming a drain on public resources, and you're definitely not even taking care of your own self. You're living in your own filth. You leaving needles around. Now it's a public safety issue. We got kids walking down the street, young kids who have to see or step on the needle. We don't want that. It's either you get the help that you need and we can get you that help. But if you don't want to do it, then, this is where the law enforcement side comes in. And these things always happen in swings. So the pendulum swung so far left for so much of a period of time. We can talk about the politicians who are in office and then the COVID whole thing. And I'm seeing it starting to swing the other way. People are starting to say, you know what? Yeah, we went a little too far that way. Even some of the people on the extreme left are like, behind closed doors, like, yeah, I think we did a little too much with that.
Yeah.
We have to bring that accountability back. I'm hearing it from the mayor. We'll see if it's all talk or if it's actually real. More resources are being put into the police department. They need that support so they can go out there and do their jobs and try to get these people the help that they need. And if they don't want the help, then they will be held accountable to it. And bringing that to a city like this is going to do wonders for it. So one thing that has come up, because this problem is so wide, unfortunately, there are people in my network that I know that have friends and relatives who are caught in this whole cycle. They're living on the streets. They don't know what to do for them. I have one person in mind who their mother is living on the streets. They try to give her resources. They try to put her in housing. She leaves. She goes on and gets back out on the streets. They have to go find her, whether in Oakland or San Francisco, to try and get her help, and she doesn't seem to want it. So in your opinion, how best can even family who want to help their family members get off of this, what can they do?
It's really hard because there's just not a lot of options, right? We can't, if you try to intervene and do an intervention, you can, but drug rehabs don't have locks on their doors.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you can get that person committed to a mental institution, which is next to impossible because we just don't have a lot of those resources anymore, that do have locks on their doors, not a lot you can do there. If you scoop them up and put them in housing, whatever's afflicting them, whether it be drugs, mental illness, or both, that causes them to go back to the street hasn't been addressed. So there's really no easy answer to that question. So this is why I support things like the Governor Newsom has recently stated that he's going to introduce a bond measure that's going to fund $10 billion to beef up our mental health system in California. I agree. I mean, I'm not a super huge fan of Gavin Newsom. Okay, I'm not. Sorry, even though I'm a Democrat.
Yeah,
I don't want to get too political, but right, bro.
Yeah.
So if you want to edit that out, go ahead. But I'm just saying, right?
Yeah.
It's like, look, we talk about housing all day long. This is where I come back to about the money, and this is where it matters. Like, we've spent $20 billion to house a bunch of people in old hotels and motels in California over the last 5 years, and told them that they can shoot dope inside the hotels. We said it's okay because that's harm reduction. It's okay.
That's so nuts.
And not spending any money on building drug treatment beds or mental health beds for people that actually need it, so that people like your friend's mom would actually have a place potentially to go. Sometimes a place to go where they're conserved and have a place to go. And this is what's making me scratch my head about the care court thing that they just started implementing in California, which I generally support the idea of making it easier for people to be conserved. Those that are gravely disabled, struggling with mental illness, and now struggling with severe addiction can be conserved by the state, right? That's great. Now, where are we going to put them? That's the real question. Where are we going to put them? And so I like the idea. I don't like the idea that we keep doing this as a state and as a society in America, as we keep making these changes to laws that affect our social issues, our social problems around criminal justice reform and around drugs and around homelessness. And we make all these changes to the law to decriminalize and to destigmatize and to promote harm reduction and all that. And there's no infrastructure.
Yeah.
There's zero infrastructure to support it. So we need to stop putting the cart before the horse and actually come up with a plan to build infrastructure first. And then you can go ahead and make all these changes, because I think I told this to you earlier. In 2015, when they passed Prop 47, there was 115,000 homeless people in California. Between then and now, the state of California released 70,000 people from prisons, either to county jail or to probation or out. And the homeless population at the same time grew by 70,000. Now, there's not necessarily, I can't prove a correlation between the two, but there's definitely a causation between the two, in that a lot of those people that were released from prison went back and turned down the resources that were being offered to them, or went back to counties where there were no resources for them, or went back to communities where families wouldn't welcome them back anymore. And they ended up on the street.
Yeah, that Prop 47 thing. And I remember when they were talking about that, 10 years ago, whatever it was, and they kept pushing it as we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on prisons. And why are people in prison when they've done non-violent misdemeanors or felonies? Why don't we just take that money, close these prisons or private prisons? There was a couple in the state, and then go put in resources. Because then if we let these people out, they go get resources and everything is going to be better for society. They're going to get the help, and then they're going to go be productive members. And then there was another side of us that were like, I would love for that to have happened, but we all know if you don't hold people accountable, you give them that chance, eventually people are going to catch on to say, how can I take advantage of this?
Let me give you an example about the resources that the money saved on Prop 47 was going to do. So there's one drug rehab in San Francisco that I know of that has a detox center. Money from Prop 47 was put into a grant that they were able to access some of the money for that grant, and that grant paid for 5 detox beds. So that's how the Prop 47 money broke down. It got embedded into the system, and it ended up helping one drug rehab pay for 5 detox beds. That's great. In the meantime, we got 70,000 dudes that got released from prison. And San Francisco only has 2 halfway houses for people coming out of prison right now. 5 detox beds, but if you're not addicted to drugs, well, you're going to be now, because you're out on the street. There's nothing else to do but get high. So you have to think about, again, the lack of the infrastructure, and how does that money really saved even translate into the resources that we think we're supposed to be seeing from this. And again, it's misguided. You remember Prop 47 was pushed as the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. That's what it was called. Neighborhoods are not safer, and neither are schools when you have encampments in front of it. I'm sorry, it's not.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on how these bills are pushed out and what they really are as a whole.
Yeah. So, and so it sucks because, I don't want to get too political, but at the same time, politics play a big part in this. Policy plays a huge part in our homeless crisis and drug crisis. Drug policy is a huge issue that nobody knows about. Nobody talks. I've dedicated the last year and a half of my life to just studying drug policy, reading research papers, getting really, really familiar with drug policy. And I've decided that I want to kind of pivot my whole advocacy towards making pragmatic changes to drug policy, because that's what's driving a lot of this. The whole radicalized harm reduction movement lives within drug policy, and that influences homelessness. It influences housing policy, and it influences criminal justice reform. And so that's one area where I'm placing my focus and bringing my lived experience to that, to try to influence people to kind of pump the brakes a little bit as we're kind of driving off the cliff with our drug policy in this country, where there's even a push now to legalize. So legalize marijuana, cool, got you. Decriminalize psychedelics, maybe with more research, yeah, cool, okay, right? You want to make it so that you can walk into a fentanyl dispensary and get some Fenty for you, or your 18-year-old or 21-year-old kid can walk in there. Are you cool with that as a parent? Are you cool with your 21-year-old walking into a fentanyl cafe? They can sit down and have an espresso while they smoke some Fenty on foil, because that literally, think of that image. It's either that, or we go back to pill mills of the 90s when they were overprescribing medication to people and you got 20 million people addicted. There's no in between. There's no nuance.
Yeah.
The safe supply and legalization drug efforts. Like that's the insanity that you have to think about. And that's what is trying to be pushed right now. Really big in Canada. There's a big push for that in Canada to do stuff like that, and to a lesser degree here. And I'm going to fight with my last breath to stop that.
Well, you know what's so crazy about it, and we were talking about heroin earlier, and about what the problems that's brought. And the thing about heroin is it's a plant. You have to go grow it somewhere. You need land to do
right.
it. But then when you see how fentanyl is produced, I mean, it's crazy how you see people mixing bags of chemicals in their backyard, no bigger than probably this room than we're in, and they're making a ton of this stuff every day. Like, there's just no way that you can stop it. It goes back down to what we were talking about earlier. How do we address the whole, demand part of it? And you mentioned the mental health workers, and I think it's great if we can pour money into that, because that's definitely low-hanging fruit that we need to address. But the challenge that I see with it, and you can probably speak from what you've seen with the street recovery team, the fire department, they have those vehicles. Who wants to do that job? Like, if, people hear this and they think we need more mental health workers, and I'm like, yes, we do. Who wants to do it, and how much are you going to pay them? Because you're asking people to go on the street unarmed, untrained in terms of how to defend themselves physically. And you want them to go talk to people you don't know if they have any weapons on them. You're trying to help. You're trying to do the right thing. But if that person lunges at you and you have no way to defend yourself, now you're putting yourself in harm's way, trying to do the right thing. So this is the reason why this has traditionally fallen upon police officers, is because at least we're trained to defend ourselves and to say, how can I make sure this person's not going to harm me? But to a mental health worker, I mean, that's putting a lot on their plate. And then again, how much do you want to pay them? If you're somebody who's thinking about going to that career, how much is it going to take for the state to pay you to say, okay, I'm willing to put my life out there to help these people? It's going to be a high amount. And then is that something that the taxpayer is willing to front money for? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So you get hired on the street wellness response team. It used to be the street crisis response team, but they wanted to make it sound better. So now it's called the street wellness response team. And so, if you're a social worker, you're probably making about 85K a year. Okay. If you're a paramedic with overtime, you're probably making, close to six figures. If you're a case manager and you get hired to work on the street crisis response team, you're making $25 an hour.
Holy man.
So you're being asked to do everything that you just said for $25 an hour. You're right. Why would you want to do it? Right. And then the ones that do want to do it, it's noble that they want to go do it. And some of them just need a job. Some of those folks that do it are in recovery themselves, right? That go out and do it. My first job out of rehab was as a case manager in permanent supportive housing. I worked with the chronically homeless. I was cool with that, but I got paid $23.48 an hour. And I had to take that because I needed a job.
Yeah.
Right. So, but also at the same time, you get what you pay for, right? If you paid someone $50 an hour, you'd get someone that'd be willing to, maybe stick it out for longer, so there wouldn't be a lot of turnover, and be more understanding and acceptable of the risks that are involved when you're engaging someone in crisis that's out there on the street. And what's odd is that, the Coalition on Homelessness in San Francisco, they're the ones that did the injunction to block the homeless encampments from being removed in the street, which caused tremendous damage to San Francisco. They support something called CART, which is basically like a similar response to the street wellness response team, but with no police at all, which is just interesting to me when you think about, just from my experience on the street, there are people that are in crisis that are out there, but if they're sitting there using drugs and they're living in a tent, they might want some services from you, but every once in a while you're going to run into the guy that's having a meth-induced psychosis episode or other type of psychotic break, and you're not going to have any type of police there as a deterrent to help you with that. And I can see that ending very badly for a person or a group of people that approach. Why do you think when media goes out and they talk to homeless people on the street, there's always security, right? Even without a camera, they just go up and talk to them. They have security because they don't want to, you don't know, right? You're coming up into someone's house basically because they're living in a tent, and you're like, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? The first thing they're going to say to you is, F you. What do you want? Right? And you tell them, oh, I'm with the media, or I'm the street crisis response team. You're going to get different answers. Well, if you're street crisis response, you got any food? Can I get some needles? Can I get some pipes? Right? And they'll give it all to them, right? And then the street crisis people will be like, are you okay? Do you need medical help? They'll be like, yeah, I'll get some medical help. I've got this abscess here. they'll fix that for you. Um, and then the street crisis people will be like, well, there's a shelter bed open if you want, or maybe we can get you into treatment in a week or two. And they're like, yeah, I'll think about it. Okay, come back and see me. And then they leave. And that's the definition of meeting people where they're at,
Yeah.
right? But we're meeting them where they're at and we're leaving them there. So again, it's about trade-offs and drawing the line. When does that street crisis response team say, you know what, this is the 4th time we've come out and seen you, and you're out here defecating on the street. You overdosed 6 times already, and you were brought back from death. You have body lice and you have open abscesses all over you. When are we going to say, you know what, bro, that's it. You got to come with us, and not give them the choice. Because the harm reductionists will just say, well, no, we just have to keep going out there and doing outreach until they eventually trust us. Well, one day you're going to go out there and he's going to be gone. And the reason he's gone is because he's already dead. And that's on them now, not on that person. That's on that person. That's on this street crisis team that didn't actually intervene. And I have strong feelings about that. I'm all for street crisis response and homeless outreach teams. But at a certain point, you have to say enough. This is the 30th time you've outreached to this person, man, and they won't accept help. You have to try to do more. And sometimes they do, and sometimes it's beyond their scope. The person's schizophrenic. There's no mental health bed for them to go to, right? But sometimes it's just because you have to respect their body autonomy and respect their civil liberties, and then they end up dying with their rights on.
That's a whole nother conversation there. There was something that you mentioned earlier to me before we started recording here about what do people tell you when you go talk to people on the streets here, LA, Austin, New York, whatever it is. Why is it that they don't want help? When you ask them, why don't you do this? What is it that they're telling you about why they don't want to go to housing?
So I've talked to, I don't know, a couple of thousand homeless people on the street. Probably more, because I've talked to hundreds in Texas and in Colorado now, et cetera, in Oregon. They all want 2 things. They have a laundry list of things that they want or that they need. One of the main things is they want to get off the drugs. So the people that say that there's people that don't want to get off drugs, that's a misnomer. They do, but let me explain, okay? And they also want to get housing. And let me explain that too. They want those 2 things, but they want to do those things on their own terms. They don't want anyone telling them, this is what you have to do. This is where you have to go. These are the rules. This is the drug you have to take to get you off of the drug that you're on. This is how long you have to stay here. This is how much belongings you can bring with you. Nobody wants them to abide by those rules. So they only want to do it on their own terms. And for someone struggling with addiction, even though they'll tell you that they want to get off drugs, that usually doesn't mean today. Usually it doesn't mean that. Usually it means that, that's a vision I have for me in the future, but not today, man. I think I'm going to keep using. So if you would give them a house or an apartment, and then you just say, okay, this is your apartment on your terms. Here you go. But we also need you to stop doing drugs on your terms. When you're ready, they'll be like, cool. Let me get back to you on my terms. I'll be ready soon. That soon turns into a week, month, a year, and never, because that's the nature of addiction. It is a disease of the brain, of the mind, that implants itself in your basic survival instincts and doesn't give you a choice after a while. You don't have a choice. You have to use. And the only way to mitigate that is to stop. But if we let someone who's struggling with addiction manage everything on their own terms, they're never going to stop. Never. We have to be real and honest about that. And once we're real and honest about that, and understand that 85% of the people that we're encountering on the street right now are struggling with addiction, maybe that will help us rethink our approach.
That is it's so powerful to hear that, because most people just want to assume if we give the resources to everybody on the street, they will A, accept it, and B, they'll run with it and become better people. And I'm sure that there are people on the streets that just need a little bit of a kick in the rear end. I've met several people, and you're exactly one of them. We have the resources available, and we look at them 2 years down the line, and we can't believe that's the same person that I ran into back then.
That's right.
Like, they took the initiative and said, whatever was the motivation, maybe they had kids, or maybe they just hit rock bottom and there was nowhere else to go but up. They were able to say, I'm ready to make this change. They committed to it. They did the hard work that was necessary. They got support from the state in terms of housing and financing. And then now they're productive members of society again. And those are the ones we really want to get out there so that you could do it.
The big change now though is fentanyl.
Yeah.
I can't stress enough, guys, how much fentanyl has changed the game. There's no more aha moment for people, man. There's no more. You got to use every 2 hours. There's no more like, oh man, I'm going to get clean today. Oh, but let me just, every 2 hours, you got to stop and dose. You got to use every 2 hours. It's just, there's no more moment of clarity that alcoholics used to get. You hear that term, as alcoholics say, I had a moment of clarity. That doesn't happen with Fent. I'm sorry, it doesn't. So, we have a choice with people on the street. So we're talking about the subset of people on the street that we see living in tents and unsheltered on the street that are struggling with fentanyl addiction. Just that subset of people, which is about, out of the 4,500 that are unsheltered on the street in San Francisco, it's about 4,450 of them.
Oh,
Okay. We have to start thinking about intervention, because if they're never going to be ready, so we either have to intervene, and that means law enforcement to help us with that, or they're going to die. And we just have to decide as human beings, as a society, as a community, are we comfortable with all those deaths on our head? Because right now, since 2020, it's been 3,000 dead people in San Francisco. Your brothers, your sisters, your fathers, your mothers, your cousins, your friends, dead.
that is nuts.
If we had that many deaths from COVID or from gun violence or from car accidents, do you think that would have elicited a different response other than, oh, we should just support them? So, you really have to think about it, right? Drug overdose kills more people in the United States than gun violence and car accidents combined right now. And our response is we should just support them and continue to let them use safely? Are we going to do the same thing with guns? We're going to continue to support you and just give you a gun safety class, but you go ahead and keep your guns. And the reason I say that is because the very same people that are advocating the radical harm reductionists that are actually advocating for safe supply and drug legalization and more harm reduction services would also very happily at any moment repeal the Second Amendment in this country and ban guns completely and bring us prohibition on guns completely. The hypocrisy has to be pointed out, especially when drugs are killing way more people than guns are in this country. Period.
Yeah.
I have to say it.
No, this is real talk, and that's the whole point of the show, is getting this information out there, which, by the way, if you're watching or listening to this episode, if you're enjoying it, please subscribe to the channel and like the video and share it to people that you feel are going to get a lot of value from this. With that being said, we were talking about the camps or tents earlier, and going back to people don't want to change, it's almost like the term homeostasis. When your body's comfortable, we don't want to mess with it. If somebody's in a tent and they have, their clothes hanging on a fence behind them, they got their little portable stove, they have everything that they quote unquote need, and nobody's bothering, there is no incentive to change. Me and you could look at that and say, why would you not want to get a roof over your head? Why would you not want to get an apartment or buy your own home and build all this stuff? But to some people, it's like, well, this tent's good enough for me. I have my little stove, I have my sleeping bed. And if it ever gets too cold or too wet, I'll just pack this up, go to a shelter. And when the rains pass, I'll come right back out here and do my own thing. And it's that mindset that we have to make sure that people understand does exist. And one of the challenges that people say is, well, okay, let's just build more shelter. If we build more shelter beds, hypothetically, if we have more space and we build 5,000 beds, then everybody should want to go to the shelter, correct? It just makes sense. But that's how me and you think. This is not how people on the streets tend to want to think. So can you talk a little bit about what the pushback is from people on the streets that you've talked to, why they don't want to go into a shelter? Are some of the big reasons why they say they don't actually there in terms of violence, in terms of not bringing their pets or their clothes or whatnot? How does that whole thing look?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So look, there's a certain degree of rationalization that occurs when you end up on the street. I remember when I finally ended up out to the street, it really sucked. I was despondent. My wife had slapped a restraining order on me. I couldn't see my kids. I was lost. And I was like, I can't believe here I was at 47 years old, homeless on the streets of San Francisco, man. Like, how did I get here? Like 10 years ago, I had a $80,000 a year job and 2 cars and starting a family and owned a house. And man, now credit, going to Vegas, going trips, and now I'm homeless. I'm like, dude on the street. I'm a bum on the street. That's how I looked at myself, as I was a bum on the street. And you start rationalizing that, and you start deciding in your mind, as I think is a survival instinct, that I can make this work, right? And then pretty soon you get used to that, to thinking that. And then you figure out a hustle on the street, a way to make ends meet on the street, right? Where to go for food, how to hustle up a little money for drugs, or how to hustle up some drugs. Those kind of, you meet other people on the street that are doing the same thing, and they become your quote unquote friends, right, on the street. And you rationalize it, and then you kind of get used to it. And now that's your lifestyle. And that is what has happened to a great many people on the street. And getting them out of that lifestyle is a huge adjustment. It requires a great deal of risk on their part, because they're now afraid to give up what they've become used to. So the things that seem common sense to you and me are no longer, or logical to you and me, no longer seem logical to those individuals, because many of them, again, are struggling with addiction. So the end result of any logical decision that they make has to end with them getting more drugs. And now you're asking them to do the exact opposite of that and stopping drugs and going to treatment, which so to that individual in that state of mind is illogical, right? It's pretty straightforward when you think of it like that.
Yeah.
It's illogical to that individual in that situation of being stuck and trapped in addiction. So we offer shelter, right? Let's say we build 5,000 shelter beds, and we go out and we offer people shelter, but we just say, it's voluntary. You don't have to take it. You're asking a person to start to potentially leave behind what they've become used to and go to the shelter, which to that individual at that moment is illogical. So they're not going to do it, which is why the majority of people that we outreach to now, when we do have shelter beds, turn it down. Now, again, all the homeless activists and everyone will say, well, shelters suck. There's crime, there's assaults inside, there's drug use, people steal your things. Yeah, there's some truth in all that. Shelters aren't great. You mean to tell me that the street is the Ritz-Carlton? You mean to tell me on the street that those things don't happen? Of course they do, right? But in a shelter, you get fed. You have a bed or a mat or a cot to sleep on. You have showers, bathrooms. If you want to use drugs, you just have to go outside. You can use drugs outside. You just can't use them inside. What the rule, the big things that are barriers for shelters, aside from the logical, illogical dichotomy that we just talked about, is no drug use inside. So after 10 o'clock, you're screwed. You have to wait till 6 a.m. to go outside and use. And if you have to use fentanyl every 2 hours and you've got to now wait 8 hours in between, that's not going to work for you. Right? That's one. Two, a lot of people out there have pets. They can't bring pets. Some shelters are now allowing them. And then you're limited into the belongings that you can bring with you to like 2 bags worth, two trash bags worth of stuff that you can bring with you from the street. And look, I was on the street, man. I didn't have a lot of stuff. I don't know why people collect shit on the street. I don't know.
I see you guys like pushing 2 shopping carts full of I don't know what in there.
Bro, look, in the 6 months I was on the street, I had 2 jackets, a beanie, a couple of beanies, 2 pairs of jeans, and a couple of pairs of shoes. And that was pretty much it. That's all I had. I didn't even sleep in a tent. I slept on cardboard. Right. And so I'm not saying, people don't have belongings, right? They do. I get it. Right. But, again, homelessness is about trade-offs, right? In those shelters, and it's not just food and a shower that they give you in the shelter, you have access to case management. So if you were really motivated, you could find a way to get into treatment and also do a housing assessment. So you can at least get on the wait list, which is 3 years long, by the way, or somewhere between 1 and 3 years long for permanent supportive housing in San Francisco. But at least you can get your name on the list, right? And start that process if you're motivated. But if you've already rationalized and made the decision that you're comfortable with the lifestyle you were living on the street and you're struggling with addiction, all of those things we just mentioned about shelter seem illogical, right? And that's why we need to actually compel people to use shelter. We need to enforce camping bans and be like, you're either going to go to a shelter I can get you into a detox bed, and while I get you on the list for housing. And if you don't accept either of those two options, you can't stay here and camp on this street, and you can't go around the corner and camp on that street either. But we do have the Homeward Bound program. I can get you a bus ticket back to Mendocino, where you came from, if you want, tomorrow. But you can't stay here. So you need to make a decision on what you want to do. And that is where the rubber is going to meet the road.
Yeah.
And we're going to have some difficult trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
And the city's going to be met with a ton of resistance. But I promise you that every city in the Western United States, from Denver to the coast, is about to face that problem.
Gee.
And they're going to be forced to make that decision because the problem's so out of control. Now, I appreciate what Mayor Bass in LA is doing. She's housed a lot of people since she's taken office in motels and hotels. But what they don't tell you is how many of them have rotated already back out to the street.
Mm-hmm.
And have continued to, because again, that lifestyle, they don't want to leave. They've become used to that. They don't want to leave it behind. It's hard. I remember when I worked in permanent supportive housing in the city, we took a guy that had been homeless for 10 years and we housed him in an apartment in San Francisco. He was a studio apartment with his own kitchen and bathroom in his apartment. Did you know the first month he was in there, he slept on the floor? And he hoarded all his garbage. He wouldn't throw it away until like we had to go in there because there were roaches and stuff. And he was still sleeping on the floor. He never slept in his bed because he'd become so used to sleeping on the street that sleeping on a bed was like sinking into a marshmallow for him. And he was so paranoid about his stuff, quote unquote, that he wouldn't even throw his own trash away out of his room, right? These are the kinds of challenges that they can deal with when someone gets housing. But we're not even there yet. We're just talking about people transitioning from the street to the shelter. So that's why people are resistant. That coupled with the drugs.
Yeah.
Those are the two factors right there.
So pretty much even if San Francisco were to hypothetically build all these shelter beds that the courts are saying you have to have this many or you can't enforce certain laws or whatnot, while it gives the city more authority to push people out and say, okay, you choose not to take it and you're camping on the streets, we're going to enforce the ordinance and move you on. Is that going to be enough to help solve the problem? Or is it they might just do the whole bus ticket thing, say, okay, I'll get on a bus back to Mendocino, and now they become Mendocino's problem and they have no resources at all to deal with this? Is it more of we're just going to push the problem to somebody else?
So I think you hear a lot of politicians say, we're going to solve homelessness in 4 years, or we're going to solve homelessness in 10 years. I'm not going to say the politicians have said that. There's a whole bunch.
Yeah, they have.
Mayors of major cities, governors of states, presidents of the United States.
Well, Giuliani did it, right?
That said we're going to end homelessness in this minute. Well, Giuliani brought the right to shelter to New York City that still exists today. So yeah, he kind of did. At least he found a stopgap measure as a way to manage the problem. And I think that's what we have to think about it as. Are we going to end homelessness? No, I don't think so. But we can manage it and we can reduce it a great deal. But we have to understand that it requires what they call a continuum of care, right? For people that aren't struggling with addiction, it requires stabilization, shelter, and then moving on into some type of housing, right? And job supports, things like that, help you get your ID back. Any criminal justice issues, take care of them. All of those things that work in the case management part of it to help that person. For someone that's struggling with addiction, it also starts with stabilization, and then detox, and then treatment, transitional housing, with workforce development integrated and all the other legal stuff integrated into all of that. But what they've decided to do is just take all the people that are homeless, including the ones struggling with addiction, and just skip the stabilization, skip the shelter, and just put them into housing. And it's shitty housing.
Yeah.
Okay. It's SROs in the city that are old hotels and old converted motels that have been made into housing, quote unquote, and drop them in there with no preconditions because of low barrier. And then any wraparound services that you have that are available to you are all voluntary. You don't have to access them.
Jeez.
And they wonder, and you wonder why there's so many people, like 5% of all the people in SROs are dying of drug overdose. When they put all the people in shelter-in-place hotels during the pandemic, the 2,200 homeless people they scooped up and put in hotels, spent $260 million on Now there's now after the fact, 5%, another 5% died inside those hotels of drug overdose, more than who died of COVID.
Yeah,
right?
that was, oh, yeah.
Right? Insane. And at least $45 million in damages to those hotels have already been claimed against the city to pay for.
Yeah, nobody talks about that part.
Right. So,
Jeez.
nobody, it's like, come on, right? So I don't understand why there's no focus on stabilizing people first and just literally scooping them off the street and getting them into housing, which sounds great. That's that utopian dream again,
Yeah.
right? And it's also not realistic. You have to just be real about the multitude of problems. And I think that service providers understand this.
Mm-hmm.
Even the ones that don't agree with the stuff I'm saying, they understand there's a multitude of problems, but they feel like if we put them in housing first, then we can address them better, right?
Yeah.
But if those problems are all voluntary, if addressing all of those things require a voluntary response from that individual that's not thinking logically because they're addicted to fentanyl, what do you think the outcome is going to be?
So with that, I wanted to talk about the success or lack of success with some of these programs that I have seen here. Specifically, there's Urban Alchemy. If you can also, I know we talked about it last time, but if you can explain to the people what that is. And also some of these programs, I'm not sure what it's called, but I've seen people on the streets pushing around garbage cans and brooms, and they're actively cleaning up. And
Yeah.
I think it's some sort of like recovery program. Can you explain that? And if those attempts to give people, I guess, something to do or a purpose, does that really work the way it was intended to?
Yeah. So it's a mixed bag. So Urban Alchemy is a big nonprofit that they're a service provider. They provide street ambassadors, or practitioners is what they call them on the street. People that are used as a non-police response to secure certain blocks, to kind of keep people moving along, hopefully, to an extent, keep drug dealing away from certain blocks in the day. And they work from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. out here in the Tenderloin. They also man a couple of different mobile bathrooms that are in the Tenderloin. And they generally do a pretty good job of securing those areas and being a resource on the street for people, I guess. Their employees that are out there on the street are mostly made up of ex-cons that served a lot of time in prison, that would have difficulty obtaining another job. So in that regard, yes, it is beneficial because it helps those guys gain employment. Are there downsides to it? Yeah, there's downsides to it. Certain blocks of Urban Alchemy, certain people that work for Urban Alchemy, they kind of run their blocks like a prison yard a little bit. So there's that prison culture that kind of came out with them that's prevalent. Also, you're putting people that maybe were in recovery in those jobs, and that's a really tough situation to be in, man. You're out there amongst the dealers, amongst the dope, amongst the drug users, and you're trying to stay clean and sober. Some people fall because of that. But overall, I would say that it's probably more beneficial than it is harmful to the city. So that's fine that they're there. Then you have the city streets, the clean team that's out there, the guys pushing around the garbage cans, cleaning up the streets and sweeping up the streets and doing block activations and things like that. Again, same type of situation where they're hiring people that otherwise, maybe have felony convictions that would have difficulty getting jobs. So that is a good thing, right? And also it just kind of creates more of a presence on the street that's not this kind of lawlessness, kind of drug culture out there. So I can see the benefits to that. There are other programs that are in the city that I wanted to talk about. One specifically that's actually starting to make a real difference. And that's actually through the Salvation Army in San Francisco. They've started an initiative called the Way Out Initiative, which is a homeless initiative. And they basically created the city's first treatment on demand system. And the city was ordered by proposition, a vote that was done on Prop J, I think it was, in 2008, that ordered the city that they must have enough treatment beds to meet the demand of people seeking treatment. Which means that if you wanted to go to treatment, there'd be a bed waiting for you. Well, the city has not obviously complied with that. Here we are in 2023. We have 500 treatment beds in the whole city, and we have 25,000 drug users. So clearly, they didn't meet the demand, right? Does that mean all those 25,000 people want to go to treatment? No, but you have to understand too, remember, there's no incentive for anyone to go to treatment either. You can shoot dope on the street all day and no one's going to mess with you, pretty much. So there's, again, no incentive for you to go to treatment. But what they've done is they've created the system that where if you're ready to go to treatment, you can actually walk down to 1275 Harrison Street, ring the doorbell, and before the day's over, they'll have you in a detox bed, starting the process of detoxification and moving on into treatment. And that's a system that I'd like to see expanded. I think that that's the future of how we're going to have to do this. And then within that, we're going to have to get partners, law enforcement and other in public health, to partner along with this. And we're going to have to start compelling people to access those services, whether it be through the jail system and into drug court, or whether it be through other incentives, contingency management, things like that, for people to start accessing treatment to get clean. So there are some programs that are out there that are working. The stuff you see on the street ambassadors and all that, again, it's a mixed bag. There have been incidents. I've had friends that have been harassed by the Urban Alchemy people. I've seen fights break out where the Urban Alchemy people started it, right? That's that kind of jail culture, the prison culture that's coming out, right? I think that's what it is anyway. But also at the same time, they're under tremendous pressure in that, dude, you have to be on the street for 8 hours a day in a ridiculous environment, like an insane environment where you have hundreds of people around you in various states of disrepair, right, of suffering because of addiction and homelessness, plus dozens of drug dealers standing a few feet away from you or a block away from you slinging dope. And you can't mess with them because they all got guns.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? You're not law enforcement. That's not your job. Your job is to just, this is my block. I'm going to try to keep it secure, keep people moving along, and say hi to everybody and talk to people, and and try to be a positive presence on the street. But it's going to, and that's a good thing, but it's going to take so much more than that to actually bring real public safety to the streets of the Tenderloin and beyond, into the Mission District, south of Market, et cetera, like we talked about. You're going to need to have police be part of the solution.
Absolutely.
I don't care what anybody says. And San Francisco's down somewhere between 500 and 700 cops right now.
700
right?
plus.
Yeah. And they're trying to drum up, get people to come here and give them signing bonuses to come in and do the academies and all that stuff. But it takes time to build that up. And as these new cops come in, old cops retire. Right? Or they move to Walnut Creek to go be a cop up there because it's a little bit, more chill. I get it. Right? And that's the problem that we're facing in San Francisco. And, at night, on the night shift, and people don't understand, like after 7 o'clock at night, Urban Alchemy and all the street ambassadors go home. Right? And then the cops switch out 6 o'clock. They switch out their shifts into the swing shift. And then the night shift people come on at 11 or 12 at night. And sometimes at night in the Tenderloin, you only have 6 cops for the whole precinct patrolling the Tenderloin. And you have 4,000 people on the street, and you have 200, 300 drug dealers. How's that working out for 6 cops, man? That's the thing. These are the things that people don't know about. What goes on after dark in the Tenderloin, Mid-Market, South of Market, the Mission? Man, the only people that know are the people that live in that environment, and they will tell you that for many of them that live in apartments in these neighborhoods, they feel like they're prisoners in their own home, and that's really, really unfortunate. It's unfortunate for those folks. It's unfortunate for the people on the street that are in that situation. But again, we as a community have to make a decision of where we're going to draw the line and say that this is enough. And what that line is going to mean is going to really depend on who's going to be our next mayor. Who's going to be on what's the makeup of the board of supervisors going to be after next year's election, right? Those are the things that actually matter, because whether we like it or not, they drive policy, and policy actually matters in regards to how many cops we see on the street, how many street ambassadors we see on the street, how tolerant we are of people that are using drugs on the street, how tolerant we are of drug dealers on the street, all of those things. And what's interesting is that there's a big conference coming up next month in San Francisco, the APEC conference, the Asian Pacific Economic Conference, right? President of the United States is going to be here. You have like the, dignitaries from China and Japan and all over Asia are going to come to San Francisco, right? And it's just interesting to me that yesterday when I was walking around the Tenderloin, how many feds I saw out there busting drug dealers and drug users yesterday. All of a sudden, with this big conference coming up, and all of a sudden, with an election on the horizon, we have resources, right, from the feds and all that. And so my hope is that that's just a byproduct, and these resources are sustained to recreate a deterrent for some of the activities that we're seeing on the street, to improve the street conditions. Because you have to remember that reducing open air drug markets, reducing open drug scenes, which is how they refer to them in Europe, is a form of harm reduction, because you're bringing safety back into that community, and you're letting the people that are actually living there paying rent be able to walk freely and feel safe in their neighborhoods. Did you know in the Tenderloin, the kids have to be escorted to and from school, right? You know that,
I
right?
did not know that, but I believe it.
They have to be escorted to school, and then they get escorted after school while their parents are at work, and get taken to after school programs here in the Tenderloin. What other neighborhood in the city do you have to escort your kids to and from school? And what other neighborhood do your kids have to walk through an open drug scene to and from school every single day? Only the Tenderloin, which happens to be a community of color, a BIPOC community, and for all the virtue signaling that we do about equity in San Francisco, that is the most inequitable thing that I think I've ever witnessed in my lifetime in this city.
Man, that Tenderloin, I mean, there's just so many things that it needs, and man, just a matter of, are we willing to do the steps that are necessary to get that to happen? It's definitely a lot. I want to spend a few minutes here going over some questions that I got from people, and I think we can take what they are and we can go from there. Open to that?
Yep.
Okay. First question I got from somebody is, what can the average person do when they see somebody on the street in terms of calling an ambulance? So this is from somebody who walks to work, and on the way to work, there's a couple people that appear to be passed out. They probably are high or whatnot, and at some point they sort of got numb to it. Like, there's just another one. There's just another one. What can the average person do in terms of, should we bother them? Should we check on them? Should we automatically call the ambulance? What's the best way to help that?
It's interesting, because if the Coalition on Homelessness were here, they would tell you to leave them alone, right? And look, I admit, you're taking a risk. If you go and use some guy who's sleeping, you wake him up. You don't know if he's armed. You don't know if he has a knife. You don't know if he's has schizophrenia. You don't know what the situation is. So it depends on your own level of risk, of what you're willing, your risk mitigation, or whatever it is you're willing to actually decide if you want to do that. Does that mean these people are pariahs or bad people? Of course not. It just means that, look, if you were asleep in your own house and some dude came up to you and started shaking your shoulder saying, "Hey man, are you okay?" You'd probably be like, "What the hell? Leave me alone." So you have to kind of think of it in that perspective, right? At the same time, you may come upon someone that's, keeled over, and you're trying to wake them up, and they might not be breathing, and they might be dead, or they might be in a state of overdose. And what do you do in those situations? So there's really no easy answer to that question. The best thing I can say to you is to use your own best judgment. If you walk upon someone and you see, and they're out cold and they don't look like they're breathing, you could call 911. They'll come. I mean, right now, the paramedics, like 90% of their calls that they get in San Francisco are for overdose anyway. So this is just another one that you're adding into it. And that person may or may not be okay. They just may be wiped out because they've been on fentanyl all night and finally they're asleep, right? But it could also be that they're in a state of overdose. So it's really about you using your best judgment.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes total sense. Again, some people in the city get inundated because they see it so much, you sort of become numb to it, which is natural. But that's a good way just to say, if you check on them, if they're breathing, your advice might be, let them do their thing. They're basically sleeping. If you look at them and there's no movement, get on the phone right away.
Yeah. But again, it's hard to tell. Like, it's like they've got jackets on, maybe it's cold. It's the winter time, winter's coming, even though it's hot today. But,
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to tell every time. So again, it's just really exercising your best judgment. The thing that's sad is what you're saying is that it's becoming normalized. And I think that there are some people that want it to become normalized, that are okay with that because they're like, well, they have rights too. And just because they're out there on the street doesn't mean they're bad people. And they're right. They're not necessarily bad people. There some are, I'm sure, but, just like everybody. But, they're sprawled out on the sidewalk and you're actually conflicted as a human being about whether or not you need to call 911 or whether or not you should go try to check on that person, that's actually trauma that now you're experiencing. And then you becoming numb to it is actually a form of PTSD, where you've just decided to tune it out and just step over people, right? And that's not fair. It's not fair. And I think we need to be honest about that.
Okay. With that, I'm going to ask my own version of this. So if you see somebody on the street and they're holding up a sign like need money, need food, whatever it is, there's a debate of, do you give them that hoping that they're going to make the right choices, or do you let them say, no, I can't give you money, and this is the only way that I can help you, because if you stop getting handouts, maybe you'll do what it takes to get yourself right. Ideally, what are your thoughts on panhandling, and if it's something that people should work with, ignore, it makes them feel good, whatever it is?
Look, again, if 85% of the people on the street are struggling with addiction, that means 8.5 out of 10 times that you see somebody holding up a sign, they're trying to get money for their dope. That's just a statistic. And you can decide what you want to do from there, right? But if you give money, $10 to that person, and they go and buy fentanyl and they die of overdose, which is 5 years ago, they would have bought heroin and they wouldn't have died of overdose or meth. Now they're buying fentanyl, and if they die of overdose, well, damn, what just happened there? That's not a good scenario. So again, really, it's about you using your own judgment, right? Do I give money to people on the street? No, I don't. I don't give them food either, but I try to talk to them when I'm out there doing outreach on the street. I try to talk to people to find out kind of what their needs are and what's going on with them. But people that are openly asking or panhandling for money, it's like, I knew when I was homeless on the street, I knew every day where I could go to get breakfast and lunch every single day for free. So food wasn't an issue for me. Almost daily, there were people walking through the streets of the Tenderloin handing out sandwiches. So there was food. I never went hungry when I was homeless. Never, ever, ever did I go hungry when I was homeless. The only time I ever asked for money, and I would beg for money, was when I needed money for drugs. It's the only time I ever did it. And I can only speak for me, but that's the only time I ever did it, when I was homeless. So, you want to have compassion, you want to have empathy. I understand. So if you've got the extra money, you want to part with it, that's really your business. It's none of my business. If you want to do it, go ahead. But just understand that statistically, 8 out of 10 times that person's going to use that money to buy drugs or alcohol. So just so long as you know that, then you make your own decision based upon that information.
Gotcha. Well, food for thought for the listeners out there. Number 2, what is the best way to support a family or friend who is struggling with addiction, and how deep can I invest before I have to stop and let them hit rock bottom? I think we sort of touched on this earlier in the episode about somebody who has somebody on the street. I'm seeing more and more of this. People are like, this is my mother, this is my best friend, I can't just leave them alone. But at some point, what's the best way to help them?
It's so hard, because that really is what tore my family apart. That's what tore up my wife, man, was like, when was she going to have to start practicing separation with love for me, right? Because I was taking advantage of every time that a family member tried to help me, I not only took that, but I took more because of my addiction. These are things that I would never have done had I not been addicted to drugs. I still got to own it, but I would have never have done those things had I not been addicted to drugs and desperate for money to go buy drugs. Because guess what, folks? Drugs aren't free, right? So the answer to that question is, man, I don't, like, if it's your kid, like, you never give up on your kid, but that doesn't mean you're enabling their addiction either, right? And that's the thing I've seen so many parents struggle with. My own parents struggled with that with me, and I was a grown man already, and they struggled with it. But finally, they had to just let me fall. They had to practice separation with love. And it wasn't for me. It was for their own sanity, for my wife's own sanity, that she had to step back and slap a restraining order on me and kick me out of the house and all those things. And I resented the hell out of her for it, because I could no longer take advantage of that situation, right? That was my first taste of accountability in my addiction. was being cut off from all of my family. I had nowhere to go, and I was truly homeless on the street. Believe it or not, I look back on that now, and that was my first taste, real taste of accountability in this process. So, of course, my wife and my kids and my parents and everyone, my brothers and sisters were terrified that I was going to die. And they were absolutely terrified, and it traumatized them, and it caused them issues because I fell so hard. And, I think I ended up borrowing like $7,000 from one of my brothers before I became homeless to support my addiction. And I made up all kinds of bullshit lies about why I needed that money. And in recovery, I paid him back every cent. That's recovery. That's making amends. I paid him back every penny, and it was hard. I had to do it, but I had to do it. That's what recovery does, is it gives you the freedom in which to make those amends. So for those of you who are out there who have family members and friends struggling with addiction, number one, have faith. Whatever faith that is, I don't care if you worship power crystals. So long as you believe in a power greater than yourself and you have faith, that's a huge first step in the right direction for you to manage your life in the wake of this individual's struggles with addiction. Okay. And then from there, you try to offer resources to that person. But money usually is a dangerous game to offer those resources for, because they're going to use that money to deepen their disease, right?
Yeah.
Addiction, again, is the only disease that I know of that actually makes you want to make it worse. Cancer doesn't tell you in your head, bro, skip your chemo today so that this tumor can grow. But addiction does tell you that, bro, go ahead and steal that money today so you can get some more dope to deepen your addiction. That's the insanity of drugs and addiction. That's
Gotcha.
the real insanity. So that's the best answer I have. It's really like case by case, but at some certain point, you have to start thinking about your own self-care and just have faith.
I think that's a good point, is that if it reaches the point where me trying to help my friend or family member is now affecting my life and my own family, then that's where pretty much the line has to be drawn. Because the more that I try to give to this person and they're not receiving it, the more it's affecting my own life and my own safety, my own health and mental health. And, if that person really cared for you, would they put you in that position to begin with? And it can be a hard lesson for a lot of people to have to realize that. If I want to vote, but I don't know anything about politics, how can I use my vote to solve this problem? And I was speaking to somebody else who's now on the board of supervisors here a while ago, who came on the show, and he had talked about how there's just different shades of blue, like you had said, with politics in San Francisco. And we had also mentioned how some bills are promoted as X, but they're really Y behind the scenes. And in order for you to figure that out as a voter, you have to read them. And most people just don't have the time or the patience or the desire to go read what these bills are that they're voting for. So although it does fall on the responsibility of voters, do you have any advice for somebody that says, hey, if there's anything that I can look at on a ballot or a politician, what should I look at to help me make better choices for everybody?
Great questions. So the crisis of our generation right now, I think in the country, to be honest with you, despite all the stuff that's happening in the world right now, is homelessness. I think it's really the crisis of our time now in the wake of COVID. There's almost 1 million homeless people in the United States right now. And there's 20 million people in the United States struggling with addiction or alcoholism. So drugs is the other one. I think that they're destabilizing. These two issues are destabilizing large cities on the west coast of the United States. Like, it's really destabilized. 75,000 homeless people in Los Angeles.
Crazy.
Somewhere between 8 and 20,000 homeless people in San Francisco. Somewhere between 7 and 20,000 homeless people in Sacramento, right? Portland, I was there 3 weeks ago. I think it might even be worse in Portland than it is here in San Francisco.
Shoot.
Downtown overrun with tents and people using fentanyl, and fentanyl's $1 a pill up there right now, right? Out of control. So my advice to you is, even if you've been an uber progressive voter in the past, look at each candidate's stance on homelessness and drugs. If they talk about accountability as being part of the solution and support for public safety and support of prosecution of drug dealers and the breaking up of drug markets, you should probably vote for that person. That's your best bet. If they talk about supervised injection sites, decriminalization, drug legalization, safe supply, you probably want to skip over that person right now, because San Francisco is in such a dire state. And I mean that sincerely. San Francisco is really, truly in a doom loop. Despite all the beauty that it has, it is truly in a doom loop. Like, we're in deep shit. Don't know how else to say it. If we don't pivot our policy, and that policy begins with our political leaders that we send into our offices to legislate for us, we don't make changes there, the problem is going to grow beyond what's already an out of control issue, right? There might be still a glimmer of hope for us to regain some control over the situation and manage this problem. But if we don't elect the right people that are committed to public safety as being part of the overall solution, along with public health approaches to this crisis, and that, and I think all of them, doesn't matter who you vote for, is going to support housing anyway, so that's not really an issue.
Yeah.
Public safety, recognition that we need to break up the open drug scenes, that we need to really manage this crisis and restore order on the streets. You want to look at those things and then vote accordingly.
Wow. And we can only hope that deindustrialization that went on with our country for so many years, where the jobs left went to other countries, which caused a lot of people in different parts of the country to no longer have the careers that their dads and their granddads have. Some of those jobs that left are slowly starting to come back. Some industries now that we've been outsourcing for so long, like semiconductors, the high premium ones that are currently made in Taiwan, we're slowly going to bring that over here to this country, which is going to create a tremendous amount of jobs, make the U.S. less dependent on other countries and all the political issues that happen over there. And we'll see if that can be a very big factor in helping us control some of the crisis, because if we're bringing jobs back to this country, that could be a good first step to helping to solve the addiction problem. Well, Tom, this was a great episode. Thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate learning more and more about the situation in San Francisco and what the average everyday person can do to help. What's the best way for people to reach out to you if they have questions? And can you talk a little bit more about what your organization is doing to help spread the message around?
Great. Well, so you can find me, my big platforms on Twitter or X. My sign is T-Wolf Recovery, my handle. So I'd appreciate a follow there to go check out the stuff that I say. Some of my stuff is controversial. I pretty much stay in my own lane. I talk about drugs, homelessness, criminal justice reform, a little bit about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but pretty much just stay on those three topics. And really just calling out San Francisco and what's happening in the Western U.S. around that issue. You can also visit me. I have a website. It's www.gooddrugpolicy.org/PAPR. And that's for my nonprofit. You can check me out, our resources, the organization I'm with, the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. We're just trying to be a balanced, moderate voice for pragmatic drug policy in the United States, where better regulation of legalized drugs already, like of marijuana, for example. But really our focus is on fentanyl and raising awareness around fentanyl and creating what we call climates of recovery in different communities, so that we put the focus on promoting treatment and recovery from addiction for people, because we feel like that's the way out of this issue.
Gotcha. That is a lot of great stuff, Tom. I'm glad you're taking the initiative on this, because we need people out there who can say from their own experiences that I've been through this, I know what it takes, and I want to be able to help people that I know are going through the same thing that I went through. And again, this episode, this was one of my most real talk episodes that there was, because this is a lot of information that is so important, and it's not a lot of information that gets talked about a lot. So if you're listening to this episode and you really enjoyed it, please like the episode, subscribe to the channel, and pass this on to anybody that you feel is going to gain benefit from it, and help spread the message. Reach out to Tom on Twitter, or now X, and he'd be happy to help you out. But thank you again, Tom.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you, man.